The wind came down off the red mountains hot and dry, tasting of dust and iron. It hissed low in the bent grass and flicked the torn banners that lay where men had died, and it carried the faint sweet reek of crushed blue petals gone brown in the sun. Eddard Stark stood with a spade in hand and dirt streaked up his forearms. His hair stuck to his brow with sweat, and he thought that heat should not cling so stubbornly to a place where his sister had bled away the last of her strength. Howland Reed's breath rasped in the stillness. A baby slept in a shawl of fine brown wool that smelled of milk and lavender and the skin salt of a woman who was not there to hold him anymore. "Promise me, Ned." The words lay cold and bright at the center of him like a shard of winter ice, and he labored until the graves were smooth and the cairns were set. 19 stones, each chosen with care, each hand-laid where the Kingsguard had fallen when the sun was just beginning to burn away the mountain shadow. Howland had bound his left side with cloth torn from a ruined cloak. The cut on his ribs still seeped. He had not asked why 3 white cloaks had stood their vigil here at the end of all things, not in earnest. Some truths were a cliff's edge. A man could know where it fell away without needing to peer down into the dark. When the last stone thudded into place and the fine red dirt had settled, Ned knelt and set the milk-white sword upon the largest cairn. Dawn lay without a shimmer in the mountain light, pale as first frost. He let his hand rest on the stone a moment. "Arthur Dane," he said, soft and even, as if he could lay a fragment of peace into the name. "You were a sword in a good hand." "I am sorry." Howland said nothing. His frog-brown eyes watched the child instead, and the wind worked the last petals of the winter roses into the cairn's crevices until blue was hiding among red. It was past noon before they turned their horses toward Starfall. The child woke once and mewled, and Ned slipped a finger into the tiny mouth to hush him so his crying would not draw carrion birds. He rode with the baby across his chest, under his cloak, the small weight tucked against him like a hot coal. When the sun slanted gold toward the west, the Torrentine's ribbon showed ahead, and beyond it the pale blade of Starfall's keep lifted from the cliff like a memory of the sword he had set down. Word of their coming had preceded them. Men in soft summer tones, a dove gray and a blue so deep it drank the light, rode out to meet the Warden of the North, but it was to the bundle at his breast that their eyes went, then flicked away, wary. There was grief in the air at Starfall, a quiet ache, a pressure behind the eyes that made voices gentler and footsteps slower. In the solar, the shutters had been thrown back upon the evening. The sea beat itself below, and a woman stood by the window with both hands to the sill, her knuckles white. Ashera Dane had the look of her brother about the eyes, Ned thought, and the long bones, and the sort of stillness that made men speak softly and carefully in her presence. She wore mourning, but even so the fabric could not swallow the clean line of her throat, the strong plane of her cheek. When she turned from the window, sorrow had sharpened her to something clear and dangerous. "Lord Stark," she said, "my brother's sword?" "In its place," Ned answered, "where it ought to be, with honor." She looked past him to Howland, then down to the bundle that slept with his small mouth parted and his fist curled tight into the frayed edge of the shawl. The sea breathed and breathed. It was a tired sound, an old comfort. "We heard," she said, "of the tower." Her voice scarcely shook. "Of my brother." "I am sorry," Ned said again. He had said it to the stones and to the hot wind and to the sword, but this was the first time he had said it to a living soul who mattered. It felt both too much and nothing at all. Somewhere in the passages a child's laugh sprang up and then died at a hissed correction. Willa came in, tall, strong-shouldered, a woman with hands used to work and milk stains down the bodice of her rough gown. She curtsied to Ashera and nodded to Ned like a companion who had been with him at the wars. "He's hungry," she announced, and held out her arms, and there was something like relief in the way the baby rooted and took. Ashera watched. She came closer by slow steps until she stood within arm's reach, her eyes on the child's dark tangle of hair, his neat little ear. "Whose is he?" she asked. "Mine," Ned said, and the word was a smooth lie that fit his mouth like a bit fashioned by an honest smith. "I'll not bandy a woman's name about for men to wag their tongues over. That way leads to less mercy, not more." Ashara's mouth tightened. He saw anger kindle there like a banked coal breathed upon. "My brother died faithfully," she said. "So did Lord Hightower and Ser went. If this is the fruit of that faith." Ned did not flinch. "If it were, I would not have ridden to your door," he said. "I have brought back your dead sword. I have no wish to see your house dishonored. Nor mine." He drew a breath that tasted of salt and heat. "I came because Starfall remembers kindness to those who have need. I came because I have need." She studied him in a sharp, long silence. "Say your need." "Silence," he said. "Discretion. A name, perhaps, if that would serve. I will claim the boy as mine in open Hearthhall and Market Square, and I will carry the lie for as long as I have breath. But the world will ask who the mother is, and the north is a long way from the Red Mountains. Rumor is a horse that can be led if a hand brave enough takes the bridle early." Willa burped the child and shifted her hold until the little dark head rested against her shoulder. Her eyes found Ashara's and held them. "I've milk enough for two," she said. "If my lady wished to trouble off her hands, I could call him mine. I've nursed many a motherless babe and lost one of my own last winter. If a lie must be told, let it be the sort that feeds a mouth and saves a life." Ned closed his eyes against a sudden, stupid sting. He had not permitted himself to think of mercy as anything but a blade and a grave since the tower. "Willa," he began and stopped because the old gods were listening. Ashara's hands left the windowsill. She moved to a chair carved like a lily, sat, and for the first time her gaze met his head-on. There was a depth there, a sorrowful, evaluating intelligence that looked across a board and weighed all the pieces. "You ask me for silence regarding a matter that could wake all of Sunspear to fury," she observed. "You ask me for the rumor that will hang about my name until I go to my gods. What do you bring, Lord of the North, to lay on the other side of the scale?" "I bring Arthur's unwounded memory," Ned said, soft. "The men who struck him are buried. There will be no songs, save those of sword skill and duty. I bring your house the return of its blade and your brother the honor I can give him, who deserved much more. And I bring my oath. I will protect this child as if he were of my blood." He paused only an instant. "He is of my blood." Ashara's eyebrows lifted a fraction. Some of the heat bled out of the moment, leaving only grief and calculation. "Dorne is not a thing to be secured with a nurse's story," she said. "You ask for a tangle of tongues to be held still all across my prince's realm. The water must be set to its bed from the source, not from the reed banks." "Then I must speak to your prince," Ned said. The words surprised him as he said them. He had thought to beg only from Starfall and be gone. But Lyanna's last cry clung still to his bones, and the child breathed against Willa's shoulder in a way that bound him to this place and its people with cords he had not expected. "I will ask him for silence. If he will grant it, I will lay across that silence any oath he chooses." Ashara's gaze did not waver. "You will go to Sunspear," she said, as if testing the sound of it. "You, who rode with Robert Baratheon, who rose on my prince's wreckage, to ask Doran Martell to hold his peace in a matter that touches Elia and her children." She leaned back. "You will be bitten," she said matter-of-factly. "Our snakes know your scent." "Then let them bite me," Ned said. "If it keeps him safe, I will bleed." Ashara looked down at her hands. "My brother trusted you," she murmured, so quiet it was almost to herself. It was the old tragedy, that he did not trust enough or too much. Her eyes lifted. "You will not go to Sunspear alone," she decided. "If Doran Martell must look into the eyes of the man who cut down his sister's champion and hear an oath, he will also look into the eyes of one who lost more than he. I will ride with you." Howland stirred. "My lady," she cut him off with a look. "Willa," she said, "pack for the child. You will come as well. No story holds less snug than one told by a man about a woman he has left behind." Willa smiled, quick and practical. "Aye, my lady." They rode at dawn 2 days later when the sea was a cold slate and the gulls' voices were knives in the air. Ned had not slept. He lay on Starfall's high terrace with his cloak around him and watched the star rise from the east, impossibly bright even in daylight if a man knew where to look. Men said the blade in the Dane's keeping came from such a fallen star. He thought instead of Lyanna's braid unraveling and the blue of winter roses pressed damp to her neck. He named the boy on the road, because a living thing ought not be nameless as the world moved around it. After they forded a stream that smelled of iron and the horses stood blowing and dripping in the shade, he looked at the baby with the solemn eyes and gave him the name of the best man he had known. "John," he said, and the name fit like a leather glove pulled over a hand. "John." Willa repeated it under her breath, as if to fit it to her tongue. Sunspear rose out of heat as if the very air had been hammered into spires and walls. Ned had seen Harrenhal in ruin, the red keep half-built and ugly red against its hill, Riverrun fretted with rivers, but he had never seen a place like Sunspear. Its shadows were knife-sharp. Its light was so bright it seemed a tangible thing. The sandship's sails hung in the harbor like colored birds at rest. At the water gardens, children's laughter scattered the guards like a flock of sparrows. Water arced and fell, diamond distant. Prince Doran Martell received them not in the great hall but in a chamber open to the sea, with pale stone floors that held a whisper of cool and a table set with sivas carved in jet and ivory. He was not tall. The heat had pressed him into a certain slowness. His hair receded at the temples and his eyes were as brown as rich earth and as unreadable. He rose from a leather chair, his left hand resting on a carved stick for a breath before he stood straight and set it aside. By the window, the sound of the sea softened every voice. "Lord Stark," he said, and his mouth tugged left before it smoothed. "Starfall sent word, but I confess I thought grief had invented some of it. Lady Ashera." He inclined his head to his vassal. "You have brought a guest." Willa did not flinch under a prince's gaze. She curtsied, broad and practical, and the baby in her arms made a small sound, as if to mark the moment. Ned could feel Oberyn Martell's stare more than see him. The red viper stood like a slash of color by the far arch, his dark eyes intent, a smile that was a bare showing of teeth at one corner of his mouth. There were 3 other men, one plump with a thin beard like a quill pen's line, one with the round heavy shoulders of a fighter, and one older with wisps of white at his temples. Ned knew none of their names. He felt all the north in him bristle at being so far from ground that knew his step. Shera did not kneel. "My prince," she said, cool and formal, "I have come with Lord Stark to put before you matters of honor and grief." "Grief I have in plenty," Oberyn said, lazy as a cat, and moved to lean his shoulder into the arch. He did not take his eyes off the baby. "Honor is a coin many men here will tell you the wolves have not in such abundance." Ned took the words as one takes wine too sour for his taste and set them aside. "My prince," he said to Doran, "I have come to return a sword and to ask a kindness. The first is done." He did not speak of Dawn lying on a cairn in the mountains. "The second I will beg plainly, for I have not your gift for Sivas." He allowed his gaze to flick down at the board and back, a small acknowledgement. "There is a child. I will name him and keep him, but he must be kept safe, and some part of that safety is silence." Doran looked at Ashera. She returned his gaze without apology. He looked to Willa and to the child. "You ask the wrong man if you ask only me," the prince murmured, and one hand flattened on the Sivas table as if to still the pieces. "Dorne does not speak with one voice in the matter of Rhaegar's last years and Elia's fate." "You have one voice?" Oberyn said sharply, and his gaze cut. "You are Dorne for the purposes of such decisions. And you are its memory for purposes of its rage," Doran acknowledged without heat. He considered Ned as if reading a book in a language he had not used in some time. "You will name him and keep him as your bastard," he said. "That is not a kindness my sister would have understood." Willa's arms tightened around the baby. Some single small muscle moved in Ashara's jaw. Ned felt the burn of shame under his breastplate, and for a moment he was in Winterfell again, standing before Catelyn with a swaddled boy in his arms and the lie whole and hot in his blood. He did not look away. I can give him my name or I can give him my breath, he said. I am not fool enough to think I can give both. The man he is said to be will not set heads hunting him from King's Landing to the Stepstones. The man he is, Oberyn repeated soft. I would know more of him. We are both asked to hold our tongues on that, Dorne murmured. Not I, said Ashera. That is my prince's choice, but my own has been made. She came one step nearer the table. My brother died for the crown that had no right to be worn, she said to Ned without anger, which somehow landed heavier than anger. I might wish to put truth into the world, but my house can keep it if keeping it keeps more blood from the sand. This child breathes. That is all that matters. Oberyn's mouth twisted. You would bow your head to the north and hold innocent a man whose hammer knocked my cousin's brother from his horse and broke Elia's heart? Your quarrel is with Robert Baratheon, Ashera said. Not with this one. For the moment, Oberyn allowed, but there was a dark laugh under his words. Doran folded his hands. Suppose, he said, that I agree. How would you have my people keep still? Every whisper in Dorne tends to be heard in Old Town and in King's Landing by morning. Rumor is our second water. Willa will say she is the mother, Ashera said before Ned could. She will take the child to her breast, in sight and hearing. Starfall's servants will say the same, and beyond them the herdsmen and fisherwomen who sell us milk and cod. It will be told to the Greenblood and on to Sunspear that Lord Stark put a child in Willa's belly and took him away again when she had done with him. There will be those who nod and those who judge and those who smirk, but no one will canter a horse to the capital over it. It is too common and too small. And you think common and small is safe? Oberyn said. I think women know how to live under the weight men make, Ashera said. This is a woman's sort of lie. It will hold. Doran looked down at the Sivas pieces. He moved a spearman with one finger and set it barely an inch away. What do you give Dorne? He inquired. For our silence, not in coin. Coin will come later, if it comes at all, and is a vulgar thing besides. He glanced once at Oberyn. Honor is better. Ned's mouth felt very dry. When I can, he answered. I will find justice for Elia and for her children. I will press it upon the king if I must. I will not break bread with those who broke your house. He swallowed. And if my word means anything to you, I will bind the North and Dorne more nearly with time. If I have a daughter, I will ask you to make a match for her when she and your son are of an age, whatever it costs me to keep that oath. Doran's gaze lifted, and for the first time there was something like surprise in it, faint and quick. You are not a Sivas player, Lord Stark, he said, not unkindly. You place your prince before you and your dragon afterward and move yourself by straight line toward a fight. But sometimes the board rewards that. I accept your oath. He drew breath and let it go slowly. There will be a record made, and a seal that will stay in my keeping, not to be used without. He inclined his head. Cause that satisfies my conscience and my grief both. Oberyn was very still, as if coiled to strike and then choosing not to. And if your king lays the head of one of ours before us as a peace offering and calls it justice? He asked without looking away from Ned. I will not call it peace, Ned said. I will not call it justice unless it is. He dragged air into his lungs, full of sea and heat. But I am only one man. I can offer only myself. The North will do as the North will, and the king will do as his will leads him. My oath stands regardless. Prince Doran Martell reached to the side and picked up a goblet. Condensation silvered the bowl, and his fingers left trails in it. We will drink to what can be kept, he said. I will offer Sunanspear's silence. Lady Ashera will tell the women of Starfall what should be told. Willa will be the story, and you will return to your snows and hold your bastard where all the world can see so he need not be hidden. Sometimes the thing that lies closest to hand is least looked at closely. His mouth curved, quick and dry. A good Sivas principle. They drank. The wine was pale and tasted of lemons and of something green and clean that hurt Ned's teeth with its cold. Oberyn did not raise his cup at once. When he did, he drained it in a swallow and set it down with appointed care. "If this ends in blood," the Red Viper said, "and Dorne must pay twice more for the honor of another house, I will hold you to your oath, Lord Stark, with steel." "I would ask no less," Ned said. Willa bent over the child, and the baby blew a milk bubble and laughed, a breathy little sound. Doran looked at him, and something sleepy and hurting in the prince took one half-step back from the brink. "He looks solemn," Doran observed. "Like a maester studying a flea," Oberyn said. "Like a boy who will be expected to be a man too soon," Ashera said, and her voice, at last, dipped a little toward the well of tears it had circled since the day Ned first saw her. "Gods help us all." They drew up a parchment and a replica, words written by a scribe with a cramped, meticulous hand and bound with a thread of martel orange and a thread of stark gray intertwined. The sealed door and pressed into the wax bore sun and spear and the edge of a hand a little unsteady as it came down. Ariohota stepped from a quiet shadow as if the stone itself had let him go, the long axe balanced like an extension of his arm. Ned saw the oath in that man's posture as plainly as in the wax. They left Sunspear by evening, for Ned could not bear to be away from the north any longer than he must. Jon slept in Willa's arms. Ashera rode with her shoulders straight and her eyes distant. On the second day, ash from a brush burn drifted across the road like the specter of snow and laid a gray veil over the baby's hair. Ned brushed it away with a thumb and felt something ease in his chest. For a heartbeat, all worlds were one. This dry, bright land and the forests where he would take his son to hear leaves talk in the wind. He did not speak Lyanna's name, not even to the night, but he felt that she was walking a little behind him with a hand at his back. Winterfell met them with rain, as if the sky had decided to show them Dorne's opposite all at once. The stones drank the wet, the gods would seem to inhale and grow a shade darker with every drop, and the weirwood's carved face wept red that ran and ran in thin vines across the pale. Ned took Jon to the heart tree and knelt in the mire until his knees were soaked through and his teeth hurt with the cold. The child's breath steamed. "I have come home," Ned said to the face and to the roots and to the bones beneath. "And I have kept my word." Catelyn stood in the doorway of the hall with her hair pulled back and the damp lifting it like the curl of leaves. The light behind her threw her into shadow. She was all eyes. When he put the boy into a cradle by the fire, she stood without moving for a long time. At last she came to the cradle and leaned down and looked. Her mouth was very careful. "What is his name?" she asked, as if she had chosen the smallest possible thing to say out of many.
"Jon," Ned answered.
"For Jon Arryn," she said. "It is fitting." The fire found the blue threads in her eyes. "Where is his mother?" "In the south," he told her, and the old gods bore witness to the truth of it. "She is no one who could come north. He will remain." "You will put a bastard in my hall?" Catelyn said, as if testing the hardness of the words and finding them made of iron. "Where I am to have my children." "I will," he said, because he had already asked for enough kindnesses that he had not earned. "He is mine." She looked at him then with such direct pain that he wanted to step aside and let it go past him. "Is that what we are to be, you and I?" she asked softly. "Your honor and mine, living in either hand and never touching." He did not have an answer that would soothe. There were times in the months and years that followed when he found an answer of a sort. Gentle words, gifts, patience. But that first day his hands were empty but for the promise he had made, and he kept them closed around it, and some part of the distance that would lie between them forever laid itself down then like a river at a boundary. The years, as they will, did not heed how hearts carried on inside them. Jon became a boy, solemn indeed, with a mouth that bent too little for a child's jokes and a way of listening to men that made them forget to speak down to him. Robb came red-faced into the world with a squall that set the ravens stirring in their tower, and Sansa with blue eyes that took after her mother's, and Arya in a rush like the wind off the wolfswood that cared nothing for closed doors, and Bran who gripped Ned's finger in his sleep like a climber who never quite trusted the ledge. Rickon arrived last and loudest, and Catelyn's smile went soft around all of them but one. She was not cruel. She was careful. Her carefulness did Jon harm that was no one's intention, and Ned watched and did what he could and understood that men can only do so much. The lie that had been made of women's thread and milk held as Asherah had said it would. When the first maester to come north asked, timid and curious and wrong, who had borne him such a handsome bastard, old Nan answered in Caitlin's hearing that it had been a wet nurse in the south called Willa, whom the Lord had tumbled under a fruit tree. The maester chuckled as if at a joke shared between men, and Caitlin's mouth tightened, and the world went on. If a southern peddler told a different tale, some glimmering rumor about a lady with eyes like amethysts, it blew in like chaff with the open door and blew out again. The name that mattered in the hall was Jon Snow, and his face was solemn under his dark hair, and he was kindly to Bran and relentless to himself. Every year or so a letter came that smelled faintly of lemon and of wax warmed by too much sun. Doran's script was cramped and courteous. He spoke of harvest failures turned by a late rain, of the water gardens where his children played, of Sivas boards, of the men who rode the Boneway for him. He did not speak of Elia. He did not speak of the tower or of Rhaegar or of any matter that lay like kindling between their houses. There was always a phrase or two that Howland Reed, when he came north like a shadow wearing a reed cloak, would tilt his head to see sideways, and then he would laugh, soft as frogs in summer night, and say, "He is telling you not to worry the reeds downriver. He is telling you the mud is holding." Or, "He is warning you that a new man has come into the city watch with too many ears." Or, "He says the fishmonger's wife in the street of Flower, the one with the missing tooth, is a safe pair of hands." It was not an alliance stitched with trumpets and feast days. It was a quiet thread run through the hem of a garment. Ned was content with that. Honor that made a noise was for men who needed to hear themselves. The gods of the north were silent under the snow. When Benjen took the black, Jon watched him ride out with something like hunger and something like pride. After, he followed him with his whole attention to the wall, though he had not yet set foot on the King's Road. He haunted the mews with the hawks and the rookery with the ravens, and he taught himself not to mind the whispers. "He's a quiet one, that Snow," men would say in a corner of the kitchen, "more like Lord Eddard than the Trueborn are." And someone would answer, "Ah, but he has the wolf in him as well." And someone else would say nothing at all, thinking of how he was found near the crypts alone with a candle and his mouth set as if he were speaking to stone. On a spring day when all the pools in the Godswood were full and the last ice lay under the leaves like thin glass, a raven came black against a gray sky with a twist of red wax. It bore Jon Arryn's seal, which had once been as solid to Ned as the weight of his own hand. The hand of the king asked the Warden of the North for the truth of a name in a book, the dark hair of bastards fallen from a golden line in the city, the brown-haired children of a golden lord's house. No letter had made Ned's heart go colder, not even Doran's first. He burned the parchment in the brazier and watched the ash lift. That summer, the king rode north. Robert broke the rain with his laugh and the smell of horse. The yard at Winterfell drank him like a man drinks ale after drilling too long with a smith's hammer. He ate and he kissed and he cursed and he pounded Ned on the back until his bones felt loosened, and then he asked, as Ned knew he would, to see the bones of the past. The crypts accepted him with their long cold mouths and their endless stone eyes, and Robert stood before Lyanna and wept, and Ned stood beside him and held up the tent of silence beneath which men could endure. Ned felt Jon's gaze like a touch somewhere near the crypt's mouth, and when they emerged into daylight, Sansa's voice was bright and the needlework ladies tittered at Joffrey, and Catelyn's smile was proper and tight, and the moment passed. But the whole feast long Ned felt the king's eye slip to faces. He knew the danger when he saw it. He had seen it the day he put a bastard under his own roof. After the third cup and the fourth roast bird, Robert said with drunken interest, "I am told you keep a bastard boy, Ned. Where is he?" Ned's heart jumped up and then was still again, like a fish that will not come to the hook after the first dart. "About his duties, I would hope," he said. "There is much to see to when a king is guesting with us." "Bring him," Robert said. "Bring the boy." "Tomorrow," Ned said, gentle. "He trains early." Robert, God's bless that slow, enormous heart, laughed and let it slide away. "Then we will see him tomorrow," he said, as if he had made a great decision. "A bastard is only a boy until he's in the yard." They did not see Jon tomorrow, because the morning took them to the hot sprawl of the baths where Robert soaked like a seal and told tales that sloshed while steam rose and made ghosts of his hands. Then the afternoon took them to the hills for boar. Joffrey's little mouth turned down when he saw the blood. Sansa turned pale. Arya's eyes went bright and wild with stories. Jon, who had been sent to run the hounds farther out and then to fetch steel from the smith so he would be convenient nowhere near the king, watched from a distance and said nothing. "Tell me again," Robert said later, when the wine had turned his voice soft. "Why you took the boy?" "Because she asked me. Because I could not look Jon Arryn in the eye with blood on my hands I could have spared. Because I am a man who must carry weight or I topple over. Because he is mine," Ned said. "Because no child should be hungry when I have a table and a roof." Robert smiled at him out of his spoiled bare face and put a heavy hand on his shoulder. "You always were the best of us," he said, his breath sweet and rank, "even if you do not do the things you should with that goodness." He blinked at the fire, and a moment later he was asleep with his mouth open, and Ned sat and drank cup after cup of water until his thoughts walked steady again. When the king left, he left behind a task that would tear the north loose from its stones. Ned followed him to King's Landing with 15 men, and a letter from Catelyn crumpled soft with too much reading and the smell of lemon on the leather pouch that hung warm against his side. He had Howland's words in his head, that the mud was holding, that the reeds had not been disturbed, and he had the weight of every promise he had ever made. There were 1,000 traps in the city. They sprang like teeth in cobbles and in wine and in a pretty girl's laugh. Ned set his feet where he could and walked around what he could see. He spoke with Grand Maester Pycelle and found the old man's beard contained little but ash and older ash. He spoke with Varys and found that the eunuch's eyes held a kindness that frightened him to the bone. For kindness from that quarter meant an interest that would not be put aside. He tried to speak with Littlefinger and felt something slick slide under his hand. When he looked, there was nothing in it. He did not speak with Ser Aaron Santagar as a man who knew Dorne. He spoke with him because Santagar kept the armory and the yard and men who knew the weight of steel, and because Ned had learned at last to talk to men who kept doors as well as to men who sat at tables. But after he had said all he meant to say about blades and helms, Santagar studied him long with his soft dark eyes and said, in an undertone, "My prince sends his greetings to Winterfell." Ned returned the look without a blink. "And Winterfell sends them in turn." Santagar nodded. "If ever you have need of a friendly corridor, Lord Stark, ask for the limewash storage by the south stairs of Tower West. In 2 rooms there are barrels that have never held wine. You will see a crack where stone meets stone. If you press the edge of your knife to the crack and say, 'The gardens are full,' you may find yourself out of the rain sooner than you expected. Words of this sort you do not question in that place. Words of this sort you put in your ribs like a thin knife whose weight you forget until you must use it." Ned thanked him and moved on. The seed is strong, he thought, time and again, looking at the black-haired bastards of King Robert in the meaner streets of the city and then at Joffrey's gilded head. He knew a horse breeding when he saw it. But truth was a draught that could not be poured slowly. Men would see if he held it to the light much longer. He sent a letter to Stannis Baratheon and one to Robert and waited for a wind that came too late or not at all. Cersei Lannister stood before him in the God's Wood that was no God's Wood at all and smelled of orange blossoms rather than pine, and her hair was the color of the lions on her father's banners. "When you play the Game of Thrones," she said, "you win or you die. There is no middle ground." "I am no player," Ned told her. "I am a man who would have the king know his children." He did not tell her that he had held a secret that could have torn her life to pieces and had not for pity's sake or for moral satisfaction, but because he was too tired for any of that and he was thinking only of how the world buckled and bore the weight of men's choices. He wrote a second letter to Dorne that said nothing about kings or queens. He sent with it a dried blue petal and a scrap of vellum that had been in his keeping since the mountain tower, its ink gone faint but readable if a man knew what he looked for. Doran's reply did not come. Varys's little birds had a way of finding which wings were beating where, and Ned had no interest in drawing their attention to Sunspear. But 3 days after Robert rode after a boar that would bear a king's death in its tusks, Santagar crossed the yard and came to him while Jory Castle was binding a cut on his knuckles. "The rain looks fat today," the Dornishman observed, glancing up at a sky that was a thin, washed-out blue. "If we had rain," Ned said mildly, "the stench might wash out of this city and into the sea." "At the very least," Santagar said, "we would be out of it. Down by the south stairs there is a lime-wash store. Old men say the walls down their sweat." Jory's head came up at that. He had the quick ears of a man who lived by other men not finding him where he was. Ned nodded. "Then we had best take a walk before the rains." They went with 3 men, and they slipped into a corridor that smelled of old fruit and damp stone. Santagar's directions proved true down to the texture of the particular stone under a man's fingers. The crack gave reluctantly. The square of darkness behind it breathed. In that quiet, a shape unfolded out of a shadow. A tall woman hooded deep who moved like a reed bending, smooth and sure. Ned's breath caught in his throat. "Ashera," he said, his voice hardly a voice at all. "My Lord Stark," she answered, calm. She pushed back the hood and the light from a narrow slit of window found the deep violet of her eyes. There were more lines around them now, more shadows under. The rest of her was as he remembered, the same economy of movement, the same sense that she would not waste an ounce of gesture when a half-ounce would do. "I am called Nara here. Please do not use my true name." Jory's hand had gone to steel without his conscious will. Ned put his own fingers on the back of Jory's wrist. The man relaxed as if at a touch from a master of hounds. "You should not be in this city," Ned said, though the fact of her presence made some impossible coil of his heart loosen. "No one should," she answered, and a very faint smile lifted one corner of her mouth. "Any more than a fish should choose a dry stream bed and call it a river. But I am where I must be. Doran has asked me to watch the mouths of the cisterns since the heat came on. There are a great many thirsty things down here." Her eyes flicked to Jory and back. "My prince received something from you," she said, as if they had been speaking about carpets. "He sends to tell you that the thread you carry is wound tight and should not be pulled so hard as to fray. And he asks me to ask you to count on no man whose hand aches when it closes on coin." "Janos Slint," Ned said before he could stop himself. The name felt like a stone turned in a boot. Ashera inclined her head once, and the hood shadow crept forward and swallowed most of her face. "A hand that aches closes harder when a man with a purse claps it shut. Be advised. Some snakes in this city are very simple. They move only toward warmth. Others are more interesting." She looked over his shoulder then, toward the line of rain-dark wall through the crack. "Do not be caught in the open with a wound. The ones with scales will find the blood." Jory looked at Ned. Ned looked at the shape of the woman he had first met in a hall full of music and banners and fool's crowns and set things in his hands that were not steel. "You saved my son," he said, and there it was, naked and dangerous between them. Ashara's mouth softened just at the edges, as if at a toy pulled from a forgotten chest. "I did what any woman would," she said. "I fed him. Go now, Eddard. The rain will come harder. And you have never been good at running in crowds." They met the night with their boots made quiet by the advice of walls. Ned bent his day's plans around that moment like a branch grown around stone, and the plans did not break. When the king died, Cersei moved to place her boy on the iron chair's teeth, and Ned moved to set Stannis' shadow to stand in opposition. He wrote again. He spoke to men who would listen and men who would not. He called for the city watch and for Littlefinger and for Janos Slint, and Littlefinger smiled and Janos counted, and the snake slid. Even with Ashara's warning, the turn in the yard happened too quickly for Jory to do anything but get a blade in his hand. The gold cloak's loyalties had been bought at a forgotten stair the day before with a bag heavy enough to sprain a wrist. When men began to find that their enemies had been their companions a moment earlier, their swords moved as if they were cutting air. Ned's leg went out from under him in a bright pain. He would have been trampled by the press if the friendly corridor had not been there where Santagar had said it would be. He went down those stairs with a breath he did not own. Men crowded at his back and at his front, trusted and not, and the world became a line of stones slick under his boots and the ache shocking through his wounded leg every time he set his heel. He heard shouting in the hall above and a sound like a small, ridiculous bell that turned out, later, to have been his own heart. The crack accepted him, the dark swallowed him, and when he came into light again he could smell mold and damp linen and, faintly, the very distant clean scent of something like a garden after rain. "Here," said Ashara's voice behind him, and he turned and saw nothing but shadow. Her hand came out of it with a strip of cloth and a splint. "Sit." "I cannot sit," Ned said through his teeth, which felt suddenly strange in his mouth, as if they belonged to a younger man. "If I stop moving, the city will find me." "The city is always where it is," Ashara said, calm as a winter pond. "It is men who move. Sit." She bound his leg in motions so sure a man would think she had been a midwife all her days. "Dorne says if you cannot win your game, do not play theirs. Remove yourself from the board. You cannot be cut in half if no blade can reach you." He wanted to laugh. He did not. "What would your prince have me do? Scuttle like a roach?" "Live," she said clearly. "Live long enough to call on the spears. He has not moved in 10 years. The cloth tightened and pain flared like a struck torch, and then it found a plateau where it held steady. "There is a ship that puts out for White Harbor at dawn with sacks of pepper and a cargo of men who do not smell like pepper. Dorne has a hand in the cargo list. There will be a barrel with a false bottom." "I am not a sack of pepper," Ned said. "No," Ashara agreed. "You are an oath." Shiel okayed up at him, and her eyes had the same violet he had seen in a hall full of banners when he was a younger man who had thought he knew the shapes of honor. "Swords will cross for you in places you will never see. If you die today, all those blades will bite water." He had thought, on the road north from Sunspear years ago, that he had left the last of the hard choices behind. He saw now that choices were like a road that kept turning under a man's feet. He turned. He let Ashara lead him by the elbow like a bell sheep through a pen, and when he came into the open air again it was by the river and the stink was terrible. The sky had turned the color of lead, the particular iron gray that promised more rain than the city could take. "Jory," he said. "Where is Jory?" "Already moving," Ashara said. "Do not look for friends. Look only at the planks beneath your feet. One, then the next. If you fall, I will have you dragged by your collar like a cat. And I swear to you by every god that will listen, I do not have time for that today." He did not fall. He put one foot on a plank and then the next, and in the darkness under the river stairs there was a smell like rot and lemons both. Later, he would remember a hand on his shoulder as heavy as a hammer. He would remember Santagar's voice saying something about the roll of a ship and the gods laughing. He would remember that he had bitten his tongue so hard that blood dripped down his chin and into the neck of his shirt and felt hot there when the rest of him had gone cold. When the ship put out, the sea took hold under the bird-boned hull, and King's Landing slid behind them like a waking snake letting a mouse go. He lay in a barrel with a false bottom and listened to men swear softly as they carried the pepper sacks and listened to water slap and slap and slap under the planks. He slept. It was the sleep of a man held in place by his own bones. White Harbor held him for a dozen breaths and then turned him out with fish and bread and a horse with more bone than beauty. He rode north with the wind in his face and the rumors chasing him like dogs that keep just beyond the edge of sight. Caitlin met him at Moat Cailin with her hair blown to a tangle and her mouth set. When she saw the way he kept his weight in the saddle, she reached out as if to touch his leg and then drew her hand back, and the old distance rose between them like a pane of glass. "The girls?" he asked. "Sansa is still in the city," she said, and her eyes were frost. "She is promised to a prince. A letter came. The queen keeps her." She swallowed, and the tiny muscles along her jaw trembled. Arya ran with the dancing master into the lower city and vanished. The tightness in her face threatened to break into pieces, and she closed her eyes and held it together by will alone. "Robb has called the banners." Of course he had. The sound of the north waking traveled in ravens and in the ground itself. The slow rise of men from their hearths and women from their work and blades lifted down from hooks. Ned felt very old and very sharp at once. "Send to the Crannog," he said. "Tell Howland to keep the path to Greywater closed to any but our own. If the city's snakes come feeling their way north, I do not want them finding the neck soft. And send to Sunspear. You will know how to say what must be said." Catelyn looked at him, and for one heartbeat he thought she would ask all the questions that would break the oathed silence he had kept so long that it felt like another bone in his body. She did not. She nodded once, turned, and began to give orders in the shout that only a lady of her kind could manage without losing her dignity. Men to ride, men to grind grain, a boy to find letters, a girl to scrub a floor, so that Ned Stark's boots would not track more southern filth into the room where his children slept. At Winterfell the ravens came and went like the tide, and in the yard men nailed studs into their horses' shoes and greased their sword belts and honed their edges until a man could imagine he heard that soft song under all other sounds. "If we can get Sansa clear," Ned said to Maester Luwin one night, low by the fire with his leg wrapped and throbbing, "I will call the banners back again." "You may be calling them back with crows," Luwin said, not unkindly. "You've always been a cheerful man," Ned told him, and the maester smiled with one side of his mouth. A letter came with a seal broken and resealed and broken again, until even the wax seemed weary. It smelled of lemon and of the dust of 1,000 miles of road. There were not many words. Doran did not write many words when a few would serve. He spoke of rain, of gardens, of a ship that had been seen off the stepstones bearing a black sail with no device. He did not speak of Ashera. He did not speak of Sansa. Near the bottom, in a hand tighter even than his for the last 2 lines, he said, "The Boneway is open. The Prince's Pass will be closed and then open and then closed again as suits. A viper's tongue can strike or caress. There is more than one way to get to a heart." Ned read it twice and then put it in the brazier and watched the wax bubble and run. When he raised his eyes, Jon stood in the door. The boy had grown in the weeks Ned had been gone. He had gained a span of height and a hollowness, the beginning of a man's face where a boy's had been. Ghost, who had come to Jon as if pulled out of the very bones of winter, moved with him that pale shadow at heel. "Father," Jon said, and in his voice there was something that had not been there before. A steadiness that had nothing to do with swords and everything to do with seeing how fragile a life could be. "Walk with me," Ned said. They went into the Godswood. He told Jon what he had told Robb months ago, what he had told himself for years, that there was a thing he would say when the time was right. He did not say it now. He said instead, "There is a pact. Men you do not know have put their honor on your behalf. Men you will never meet may die for you, and men you will think your enemies may save your life. You will be asked to bear the weight of that. It is an ugly weight. You will bear it better if you look at the world without hate." Jon's mouth tightened. "Is that why Lady Catelyn could not look at me for long?" "That is a different weight," Ned said softly. "There are times when we are not equal to the stories we tell about ourselves. She wanted to be. She is kind to you as she can be, but a knot tied in a heart is not undone by a wish. For that, I am sorry." Jon's breath made a ghost in the cold. "It is not your fault," he said with the cruelty of a boy who thinks that the truth can absolve pain. Then his face changed. "Is it?" Ned looked at the face of the heart tree and saw Lyanna at the edge of his sight. "It is my fault," he admitted, "but I would not choose otherwise. Not for all the world." He put his hand on Jon's shoulder and felt bone and muscle, the live wire of youth that hummed under the skin. "They will call you to the wall and your uncle will be glad of you. Or they will call you to war and your brother will. Or perhaps you will choose another path. Whatever you are called to, remember the cold and the gods and the face you make in the water when you look down. Remember that you are a man who will not break his word just because someone else broke theirs." In King's Landing, the snakes struck and struck until even their own shadows were in danger. In the Riverlands, Robb moved like a boy pretending to be his father and then like a man who had found what his hands could do. In the South, a prince with a limp hand and an old grief lifted his head and counted spears no one had seen in the sun for a long time. In the deserts, women pulled scarves over their faces and moved from shadow to shadow with a grace that would not be written down. In the neck, reeds bowed and rose. When the first Martell envoy came to Winterfell after the snows began to hold in the hollows and the ravens were wearing their thickest coats, he came not with banners but with oranges. He set them down on a table as if an offering and then said simply, "The Prince of Dorne remembers the oath you made him, Lord Stark. He sends to say that if you are ready to put it to use, you will find the bone way more hospitable than it is for most men." "He means to move?" Catelyn asked, and the words carried both fear and hope. The glow of the fire found the copper in her hair. "He means to place a piece on the board," the Dornishman said, "and see if anyone has noticed it has a knife." Ned reached out and took an orange and weighed it in his palm. He thought of Sansa's small neat stitches and Arya's wild hair and Rob's careful eyes and Bran reaching and falling and Jon with Ghost's silent shadow beside him and Rickon asleep with his thumb in his mouth because even wolves have pups. He thought of a tower that could not be seen from the road and a bed of blood and a promise. He put the orange down with care. "Tell your prince," he said, "that I will hold another kind of silence if I must. But if he lays his spears toward the lions, the wolves will watch his back, and the reeds will tug at any feet they must." The envoy bowed. When he lifted his head, something in his face that had been set like a mask softened for an instant. "Dorne does not forget, Lord Stark," he said, "and there are some debts only time can pay. That is a cruel way to settle accounts, but the gods made no other. It is a terribly long road to any peace that can last in a world where men hammer their names into steel and heat their breath with crowns." Ned knew it. Doran knew it better, perhaps, with his Syvas pieces and his gardens and his calculations made in pain. The pact that had been forged years ago in heat and lemon light held where men needed it to hold and loosened where it had to give. Secrets do not vanish when you swear over them. They put down roots the way a rosebush does, and some thorns break off in the skin and live there a long time. But there were mornings when the frost had laid a white skin over the ponds in the Godswood, and the air was so clear a man could see the shape of his breath and recognize it as his own. And on those mornings Ned went to the heart tree and stood and let the cold make his eyes water. There were afternoons when a letter smelling faintly of citrus and wax told him that a ship had slipped into the harbor at night and slipped out again before dawn, and the captain had only a riddle for his son and a memory of a woman's laugh. There were evenings when John's voice rose in the yard, calm and firm, as he called a drill for boys who would shortly be men, and ghosts slid between them like the memory of snow. There came a day when a courier from Dorne stood in the yard in a sky-blue cloak lined with white, and women came out to watch him because he looked like a summer sky come walking in Winterfell's courtyard. He bowed and proffered a letter with the orange sun and spear in wax. Within, in Doran's tight, careful hand, were these words: "The gardens are full. The snake shows its tongue. Be ready to feed what comes or cut off the head and burn the body." Under those absurd lines lay another sheet. On it, in a script that made Ned put his hand flat to his breastbone and breathe once, were words that had been written by a man he had never met and whose voice he had heard only in battle. "I, Brother Reldan of the Starry September, do testify that upon the 18th day of the 7th moon, in the year 281 after Aegon's conquest, the Prince of Dragonstone took to wife in the sight of the 7 Lady Lyanna Stark of Winterfell, with her consent and without coercion. Witnessed by..." Ned shut his eyes and saw a tower in a sun-struck country and his sister's eyes bright with fever and certainty. He saw a winter rose blooming blue against a barren wall. He saw a boy with solemn eyes and a mouth that had not smiled enough, and he saw a serpent coiled in lemon light and a patient man setting pieces on a board. He folded the paper again and again until it was no bigger than his thumb, and then he put it into the place in his belt where a man might keep a small blade or a wedding ribbon or a coin he had carried since the day he first needed luck. He did not take it to the crypts. He did not take it to Catelyn. He did not take it to Jon. He took it to the Godswood and knelt and pushed his cold, numb fingers under the roots of the weirwood where the earth was soft and smelled like things growing and dying and growing again. He made a place there not for burial but for waiting. "Promise me, Ned," Lyanna had said, and he had, and he would, and the promise had become a garden full of things that could kill and things that could feed, and he was its keeper. He pressed the last of the earth down and smoothed it with his hand. "When it is time," he said very quietly, to the weeping face where blood-red sap ran in slow lines, Let me be the one who bleeds for it, not him. A wind moved the leaves. Somewhere in the yard a boy shouted and another answered, and Ghost's pale shape drifted through the trees, soundless. Far to the south, in a place of sweet water and children's laughter, a careful prince watched a board and set a piece down and did not move his hand from it for a long time. In between, snakes slept and woke and slept again, and the world turned with that stubborn, unsentimental patience that outlasts men and their wars. When the ravens brought word of a wedding at the twins and the sort of slaughter that would be told 1,000 different ways in 1,000 different halls, Ned went out into the yard and leaned his forehead against the cold stone of the inner wall and let the chill of it into his skull until he could think again. The pact with Dorne was a thin bridge over chasms no one had looked into long enough. But thin bridges hold if you do not dance on them. He went to the rookery and drew paper and ink toward him and wrote one short letter and then a longer one. The short one went south with a raven that had more sense than most men. The longer one went with a man who had served him since he was a boy and who would not call him Lord when they were alone. When they were gone, he went to the Godswood, and John met him there without having been called, as if he had been listening to the same wind through the same leaves. "Father," John said simply. "We will need both wolves and snakes," Ned said. "We will need reeds and we will need rocks. We will need to place pieces on a board we did not make." He turned. He put his hand on John's shoulder. "Whatever they call you, you are mine. Whatever they make you, be a man with a word he keeps. All the rest we can break or bend as we must." John looked up at the red leaves and then down to the dark water, where his face, not a boy's anymore, shivered in a circle of wind. Ghost's reflection was a smear of pale under his. "I will," John said. The pact held. It stretched. It took weight it had not been meant to take. It sang sometimes under strain the way a bowstring sings when you draw it all the way back. There were days when silence was the cruelest thing steel could ask of a man and days when it was the only thing discipline could do. Dorne did as Dorne told it until Oberyn told it otherwise. The Martell's justice came in striking and in the kind of waiting that makes a man grind his teeth to keep from crying out. The North did as Ned did until Robb's ghost and Catelyn's grief pulled men's mouths awry and gave their hands an itch that no blade could scratch. Between them, in the small channels where real things happen, women went about the business of keeping lies true with milk and with a kind word in the right ear and with a knife in the dark when talking just would not do. Willa aged and laughed and told a story she did not find fair but had chosen all the same, and it saved a life. When winter showed its true teeth and the wall called men to stand and stand again on ice that cut through boot leather, the pact came north like a snake basking where the stones hold the day's heat long enough to get a body through the night. Spears in the bone way meant little when the dead walked. Lemons could not be had for love or money, and Doran's letters spoke only in the broadest strokes. "The gardens are empty," he wrote, "and the board has been knocked over." But in the root web under a weeping face there was a scrap of vellum that would still be legible if anyone ever dared to fetch it. And in a hall of pale stone on a cliff over a river that ran to the sea, a woman with violet eyes told a young lady a story about honor and mercy and scorpions and why they are called that. Ned slept poorly those years. He woke with the promise on his tongue so often that sometimes in the mornings he had to go out into the yard and put his hands on the stones to remind himself where he was. He trained boys and sent men and wrote letters and broke bread and broke silence when silence would kill. He was not a player. He was a man who carried heavy things and did not put them down because his arms ached. And sometimes, on the very coldest nights, he went alone to the Godswood and stood without cloak or hood and let the winter carve him a little leaner. He did not ask the gods for kindness. He asked for stubbornness and for cleverness and for a way to know when to take a hand off a board so as not to knock the pieces down. Once, in a spring that was really only a winter learning to breathe again, he crossed the yard and found Jon and Arya fencing with sticks. Arya's hair was everywhere, and her mouth was open and laughing. Jon's mouth was closed and smiling, a thing Ned treasured because of how rare it was. Ghost stood aside and watched as if judging. And when Arya made a wild jab that would have cut a man from ear to navel if she had been taller and stronger and carrying steel, Jon stepped aside and tapped her wrist. "Control," he said. "Again. Why?" Arya demanded, cross. "Why always control? Because if you cannot stop the blade where you wish, Jon replied. "You cannot make it bite where it must." He looked over at Ned then and saw him, and for a moment he was the child again with solemn eyes and a face that did not give away much. "That was well said," Ned told him. "It was said to me," Jon answered, "by someone who told me never to hate anyone who might save my life." He looked at his stick as if it were a sword and then laid it down. "Is there word from—" "Not today," Ned said, and gave him a look that meant later I will tell you what I can and now we will say nothing. There are languages built from glances in houses where promises live. He bent and set a hand briefly on Arya's riot of hair. She scowled at him, affectionate and fierce. The yard smelled of trampled straw and sweat. Above them, on the tower, a raven flapped and settled with a whir of wings. Letters kept coming and going, as letters always will. Men kept making choices. The board remained in play, even when a man felt the pieces had been swept away into the dark. There is a kind of victory that does not look like one while a man is living it. It looks like refusing to let go of a rope that burns your hands. It looks like standing when a clever man would sit and a proud man would charge and a tired man would lie down. It looks like a pact kept through insult and injury and the long quiet suffocations of time. The snow fell. The lemons withered in their casks. The dead walked and then were made to lie down again. Somewhere south, where water arced for children's hands, a careful prince grew older and more cautious and played his pieces in ever-widening circles. And in the north, a man with the look of winter about him watched his son become a man and knew that whatever storm came, the secret he had carried would either end it or weather it, but it would not be betrayed by him. On a day when the sky was the pale gray of a sword left out in snow and the air made the inside of a man's nose sting, Ned stood again before the heart tree and put his palm flat to the carved cheek. The red sap tracked slow. He said nothing. The promise lay in his chest as it always had, not a song, not a prayer, only a straight piece of wood laid carefully between two banks so that men and their children and the women who had lied for them and fed them and kept them alive could cross. Behind him, quiet as falling frost, Jon came and stopped. There was the faint crunch of snow. "Father," Jon said. He did not ask. He did not need to. He was a man now, and the shape of his face was his own. Some secrets declare themselves in time, as blossoms declare fruit. Some are put to paper for one prince's keeping until the moment comes when all the careful will in the world cannot keep a truth from stepping out into air and making men choke on it. That day had not come. On the day that stood, bright and cold, in the godswood where the old gods watched and did not speak, there was only a father and a son and the memory of a woman who had bled in a far bright room and put a rose to her throat and told a man to do a thing and live with it forever. Ned took his hand from the weirwood and turned. "Walk with me," he said again, because some words never wear out. They walked until the cold bit through their boots and the pond showed them their faces. Father and son where a boy and a young lord had been before. The pact with Dorne lay between them like a slender bridge and like a sword. They did not step on it then. They walked beside it. They carried it. They kept it. And, for a time, while the snow fell and men did as men will, that was enough.